I keep getting these difficult passages to preach on. Today we get two great examples of Jesus' ethical teachings. I believe that they were assembled or tethered together by Matthew in such a way that preachers down through the ages have tried to harmonize them when they probably stood alone and probably spoken by Jesus at different times during his ministry. Forgiving beyond the stipulated minimum was fundamentally new teaching at the time of Jesus. While forgiving 77 times or 70 times 7, depending on what translation you read, that was simply outrageous to forgive that many times. Yet Jesus commanded Peter to do so. The moral logic of the parable of the unforgiving servant was and is very obvious. There is an imbalance of debt in the parable that mirrors the imbalance we live with. We should forgive and forgive and forgive because God in heaven forgives even more extravagantly. I imagine Jesus capturing the attention of his listeners with the story of the servant who was given incredible clemency only to show an astonishing lack of generosity to someone else who merely owed them a pittance. It was outrageous ingratitude. St. Matthew connects these two pieces of teaching and characterizes the parable of the unforgiving servant as an illustration of the obvious need to show reciprocity in our forgiveness of others. However, some recent scholars suggest that perhaps Jesus did not intend for these to be placed back to back. So, buckle up. My advisor in seminary, Dr. Bill Herzog, suggested that many of the parables were a type of subversive speech meant to criticize the economic and political injustices of first century Syria-Palestine. His approach to the parables often turned my Sunday school interpretations of the stories on their heads. He once said, "The parables were not earthly stories with heavenly meanings, but earthy stories with heavy meanings, weighted down by an awareness of the workings of exploitation in the world of the hearers." Dr. Herzog also argued that this parable's point was likely to caution the people about being too reliant on the king for economic rescue. Jesus saw the inherent danger in trusting the king for debt relief because there was some fine print that was hidden in the agreement. Jesus may have been cautioning against participation in a bureaucratic system where kings and wealthy landowners cooperate to protect their own interests because it invariably leads to the exploitation of the rest of the community. Now, and if you've ever heard Jesus be referred to as a radical, it's because of these kinds of interpretations. What the New Testament does not alert the reader to is that there was a massive financial crisis going on in 33 AD. And that was the very time that Jesus was sharing his parables. It was likely on the mind of the Jewish populace because they were at that time a vassal state of Rome. And of course, our Old Testament shows how being held hostage in Egypt was the defining moment or the pivot point for the Hebrew story. They certainly felt the same kind of historic domination, being stuck in their homeland, but being vassals of the Roman Empire. And they were forced to participate in the empire's economy and even use its currency. So remember the story when Jesus said, "Show me the coin," and they proffer a coin with Caesar's face on it, which should not have been in the temple. We'll get to that later in the year. But apparently, Rome had long been plagued with usury, with the lending of money at unreasonably high rates of interest, which led to a culture of harsh loan contract enforcement. Now, stick with me, okay? Additionally, 70 years earlier, the first emperor, Caesar Augustus, had attempted to protect the Italian economy by passing a law that required anyone loaning money with interest to then invest a portion of their capital in Italian land. But that law fell into disuse over the next several decades, and the wealthy elites instead invested heavily in overseas agricultural development. That was until Tiberius Caesar, who in 17 AD changed and reinstituted that rule. Another thing that his stepfather had done, though, back before the turn of the millennium, was that he was giving lavish gifts to returning soldiers by giving them farms. If you fought for the empire, when you came home to Italy, you were given a farm, an estate, by the emperor. And historians think that Augustus was using his own money to basically curry favor with the returning legionnaires so that they would be faithful to him. And so he sold them or gave them farms, and probably sold them on the idea that if you want to be in the upper crust too, then you have to have farms in Italy. That was kind of the status symbol. He actually made laws that prohibiting those landowners from owning cargo ships, so that they didn't send any of the things that they had produced on their farms in Italy overseas to the growing empire. But they got around that the inability to make wealth that way through shipping by then sending their money overseas for development projects in the empire. And it was growing rapidly at the time. So even though they couldn't export the goods that they had developed on their land, they were able to purchase land and do projects overseas. So money was rapidly flowing out to the rest of the empire when Augustus, towards the end of his reign, drastically curtailed the practice of setting up the veterans with estates. And this matters to Jesus' parable. So when his stepson took the throne, he reinstated that law, and then suddenly everyone found that they were cash poor, and they had property overseas, and the new rule was you had to have 2/3 of your wealth invested in Italy. So what did they start doing? They started calling in their contracts, their loans that they had made to other people, because they had to invest in Italy. 600 of the 600 senators at that moment all were overseas more than they were in Italy with their finances. So they all scrambled. Tiberius gave the landowners 18 months to get their money back from overseas and be purchasing things in Italy. And so creditors who had loaned people money called in the loans, right? And those people who had loans with the creditors sold their property quickly to pay back the loans that they had borrowed. And so that created a problem. And then the government ended up confiscating the land of the people that were convicted of not investing in Italy, so that suddenly the government had all this coinage in the treasuries of the government. And there literally was simply not enough currency for the economy to function. It was all missing from circulation. Now that was the economic crisis when Jesus told this parable about the unforgiving servant, who owes the equivalent of, now this is accurate equivalencies, 200,000 years of labor. Those talents, 10,000 talents. In today's money, it would be $3.48 billion. And so maybe Jesus wasn't being hyperbolic when he said a man owned 10,000 talents and the wealthy landowner wanted it back, or wanted him to settle his debts. And if the subtext of Jesus' parable was criticism of the Roman economic system and Tiberius' policies, then this is undoubtedly a subversive parable. Perhaps the story is all about certain kings with absolute power who give out enormous loans, wield incredible power, and retain the right to forgive or punish at whim. Now, we don't like those types of rulers, do we? We call them tyrants. We, by the way, should be able to relate in the sense that we have our own oligarchs at work in the world. For there are nearly 1,000 billionaires in our country today. And let us not be naive, they wield immense power and affect policy daily. New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan has called this a challenge parable because there's no clear resolution to the conflict in the narrative. And it may have been that St. Matthew appended the last sentence onto the parable. This wasn't a parable, so much so more is God than the wealthy landowner calling in the debts. That probably wasn't in Jesus' original parable, New Testament scholars suggest. But the parable does force listeners, and I quote Crossan, to think, to discuss, to argue, and to decide about meaning as present application. End quote. The challenges for the hearers was to decide, do we change the tradition and run the risk of destroying things? Which is something we wonder about ourselves even in this day. Or do we do nothing and destroy ourselves through inaction? So we actually have to change in order to survive. In either event, Jesus might have been suggesting that the people should avoid participating in their own oppression. Perhaps the unspoken implication of Jesus' parable is that people should just look to themselves, to their own power of debt cancellation, and assess things from their own modest place in the social structure, well below the rulers and the senators and the power brokers of the world. Now, although it is popular these days to label someone a Bolshevik if they call to account the economic exploitation that occurs in our systems, I am not calling for class war. I think Jesus was cautioning people not to cooperate with economic systems that exploit the weak. And he had a legitimate tradition to say that. Lending money with high rates of interest is in direct violation of the Torah. God had, down through the ages, taken to the side of the weak, the vulnerable, the widow, and the destitute. If anyone is turning the tables on the elite and lifting up the lowly, it's God. Go down, Moses. Let my people go. So today, we have read the text as St. Matthew compiled his gospel. Forgive relentlessly, which is a whole nother sermon. But forgive relentlessly while having the courage to look around, analyze our culture, and question the inequity of the systems in which we participate. We are wise to remember that Jesus spent 3 years preaching about a new kingdom where the laws of earthly kingdoms no longer held sway. Indeed, his kingdom preaching and teaching got him in tremendous trouble because he said quite plainly that God's kingdom is incompatible with our earthly institutions. The end. Yes, plenty. I preach in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I once worked in a church on the south side of Chicago, and people would shout comments during the sermon. And one sermon was a particularly tough one, and someone yelled, "Ouch."